Once upon a time in the Roman Empire, armed fighters clashed in bloody exhibitions, to the thrill and delight of throngs of rabid fans, who packed into sprawling theatrical arenas across the land to witness the primal spectacles of unbridled carnage. A correlation can be made to gladiator sport as a direct ancestor to the combat sports of our modern day, such as boxing, and perhaps more obviously, mixed martial arts. It was not a path for the weak, for the cowardly, nor for the faint of heart. Being a gladiator meant you risked your life each time you entered the arena to the roar of the rabid crowd. Victory was sweet, if fleeting, and not without great cost. And defeat meant shame, grievous injury, or, worst of all, painful death. Let us take you now into the savage world of gladiators. The annals of history tend to disagree on the exact beginnings of gladiator sport, though for many, its dubious origins lie in the Campania region of southwestern Italy. Examination of burial art in the area revealed to archaeologists clear depictions of armed, helmeted combatants squaring off against one another. These pieces are considered some of the earliest known images of the era's notorious gladiator games. The word gladiator translates to swordsman, derived from the word gladius, which was, more often than not, the main weapon used by the sport's practitioners. Gladius also holds the dubious distinction of being a slang term for one's penis, illustrating perhaps that the sport's organizers were not without a certain sense of gallows humor. The development of gladiator sport can be seen in the posthumous memorial celebrations of the life of former consul Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, which featured dozens of gladiators all battling to honor his spirit, and in Scipio Africanus's Iberian commemorations of his father, who was killed whilst fighting in the Punic Wars. One notable example of this link is evidenced in Titus Flamininus's 4-day ceremony for the memory of his deceased father, wherein feasts were served and lavish displays held before nearly 100 chosen gladiators were pitted against one another over the final 3-day period. Fundamentally, there were two types of gladiators, the willing and the unwilling. The willing were secured by contract, much like the sports superstars of the modern day, and they leveraged as many comforts and perks for themselves and their families as they could. The unwilling were generally called from the slave class for their favorable physical traits. Or they were convicted criminals, sentenced by the courts to fight for their lives. If they were skilled, they would share all the benefits of life as a successful fighter, including, although rare, possibly commuted sentences. And if they were inept, they would die violently in combat, to a chorus of cheers from unsympathetic crowds. Early gladiator shows were rife with untouchables, like slaves and prisoners of the state, as featured combatants, as their lives were viewed as exponentially more disposable than those of vaunted nobles or highly trained soldiers. They could be fed to the wolves, so to speak, without a second thought. Military crossover was strong in early gladiatorial displays, which were often designed to boost morale among troops and promote a pro-national agenda to the viewing audience. Ever the showman, Emperor Julius Caesar staged battle simulations on a specially constructed lake in the Colosseum, wherein warriors could clash from the decks of their own mocked-up ocean vessels to display the fighting prowess of Roman soldiers. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Rome was the first city to implement gladiator combat as part of its military training for new recruits. And in response to strong public interest, combat sport was officially added to Italy's popular national games, often held alongside religious holiday celebrations. The average age of a gladiator was generally 20 to 35 years, although there were exceptions on both ends. With the average male lifespan in ancient Rome hovering around 40, the high mortality rate of gladiators wasn't that much of a deterrent in the large scheme of things. Early Roman scribes like Festus and Tertullian noted the correlation between posthumous memorializing and human blood, proffering that the emergence of gladiator sport could be viewed as another form of human sacrifice to the gods, or, in the case of organized mortal combat, a taboo offering to the souls of the deceased. A particular brand of early gladiator, the bustuarius, performed in upper-class Roman funerals, battling around the body of the deceased to honor their memory, and spiritually paved the way for their soul to find its place in the afterlife. In the eyes of Christianity, the connection between blood sacrifice and the human soul was decidedly pagan in nature, flying in the very face of God's word. This disconnect would later lead to the ultimate main event clash, wherein one practice would have to fall. Despite history's tendency to reflect upon the gladiator days as a brutal and bloody era that flaunted a kill or be killed ethos, not all combatants fought to the death. Indeed, some basic rules and regulations were observed during gladiatorial contests, such as the common pairing of two fighters of comparable size, age, and experience. And referee figures were in place, ostensibly to halt the action if a combatant was rendered unable to continue. In select situations, a contest might even have been ruled a draw, like neither fighter being able to gain the upper hand, and the crowd voicing its disapproval, or worse still, its indifference. Much like latter-day fight promoters, the organizers of gladiator sport invested a fair amount into the training and upkeep of their fighters. From a business perspective, having one's gladiators routinely murdered during competition was not considered a sound return on such an investment. As a result, some gladiator handlers emphasized training styles designed to wound, but not kill, opponents. Even gladiators themselves were occasionally suspected of letting opponents off the hook, as it were, and not going for the kill, in the effort to allow everyone to live to fight another day. Despite such sporting parameters, the gladiator's existence was undeniably grim and perilous, with a sizable number dying in combat before the age of 30. In spite of the dangers, by 1 AD, gladiator sport caught on with the public, and caught on in a big way. As with all new athletic premises, there will invariably be an event or matchup that comes to define what that new sport has to offer on its rawest, purest level. Such was the case with the clash between two little-known combatants named Priscus and Verus. Active toward the end of the 1st century AD, Priscus and Verus became known for a lengthy and closely contested battle in the Colosseum, a battle that instantly and singularly defined gladiator sport's inherent risks and rewards. So impressive and uncompromising were both men that their contest was judged a draw by none other than Emperor Caesar himself. Furthermore, the Roman poet Martial later wrote this glowing coverage. While Verus and Priscus were prolonging the combat, and the valor of each had been for a long time equal, quarter for the combatants was demanded with great clamor. But Caesar obeyed his own law. The law was to fight with a stated reward in view, till by his thumb one of the pair proclaimed himself vanquished. But as was allowed, he frequently gave them dishes and gifts. An end, however, was found for the well-matched contest. Equal they fought, equal they resigned. Caesar sent wands to each the meed of victory. Such was the reward that adroit valor received. Under no prince save thee, Caesar, had this ever happened, that when two fought with each other, both were victors. In the shadow of growing popularity, contests that once featured strictly incarcerated subjects and undesirable types, like servants and slaves, began to see a notable demographic change. Gladiator schools began appearing, and quickly saw their enrollment balloon, from men commonly seeking money, glory, or both. But these men weren't shadowy figures or ne'er-do-wells. Indeed, many were former soldiers, knights, noblemen, family men, and regular Joes, who'd fallen on hard times and looked to boost their status. Crowd participation was also encouraged and utilized to the utmost degree in gladiator sport, as evidenced by the routine practice of Roman Colosseum event hosts, deferring to the audience when a combatant found himself gravely wounded in battle, or opted to submit by casting down his weapons to halt the contest. Mob mentality being notoriously bloodthirsty, a felled gladiator was often given a thumbs down from the masses, which was an effective death sentence that granted his opponent the go-ahead to finish him with one final fatal strike. Through writings and works of art, however, historians have come to surmise that the thumbs-down signal that supposedly spelled doom for its recipient may not have been as it seemed. At any rate, scholars are united in the belief that Roman crowds exercised some sort of raised hand signal to cast their visual vote on a contest's ruling. But this wasn't always the case. In some instances, the crowd voted to show compassion and grant mercy to a downed warrior. While this did nothing for the gladiator's reputation, it does illustrate that spectators didn't always congregate with the sole intention of witnessing another human being's grisly demise. Still, the environment was a harsh, uncompromising, and demoralizing one. As gladiators on the day's roster waited their turn, they were treated to the sight of their fallen comrades, or sometimes more accurately the pieces of their fallen comrades, toted past them, often leaving trails of warm blood from fresh wounds. The gates used to remove dead fighters were known as porta labitanensis, with porta translating to gate, and labitanensis, named after the Roman burial goddess Libitina. There are accounts of metal rods kept heating in open fires, to be used as tools to test if an unresponsive gladiator was really dead or just playing possum. A victorious gladiator would often be lauded, then paid for his performance, while still on the blood-stained arena floor, allowing the audience to witness the warrior's reward. As for those killed in combat, there were two methods of removing the bodies. Gladiators deemed brave in death were loaded onto stretchers and carried off the arena floor like the warriors they were. But those seen as cowardly in death were dragged, since they deserved no honorable treatment as they'd already disgraced themselves in defeat. In some instances, a slave was dispatched to bash the heads of fallen gladiators with rocks or rods, ensuring that the fighter was dead and not pretending, with hopes of escaping later. And after an unsuccessful showing, there were differing ways of dealing with the bodies of the dead, depending on how they perished. Those deemed honorable were many times cremated, with any friends or loved ones able to claim the remains afterward. But those seen as cowardly weren't afforded that same luxury. Their corpses were routinely thrown into rivers, or left to decompose in fields, to be picked apart by scavengers whilst rotting in the midday sun. This was doubly offensive, as ancient Romans believed that one's soul could never find peace until the body was covered by dirt. In the event an arena gladiator was soundly beaten but remained alive, his demeanor in defeat was more crucial than some realized. Indeed, it could spell the difference between life and death. A combatant who was obviously hurt and afraid would oftentimes be executed on the spot, as there would be no further cachet in seeing him fight. But a combatant who stood defiant in loss, holding eye contact with his opponent and overseers, could be granted a reprieve to fight another day. As with many things in life, appearance was everything. Similar to the early Ultimate Fighting Championship contests of the 90s, which saw random fighters of all sizes and styles thrown together to battle until one prevailed, early gladiator matchups stood in stark contrast to what they would become once the famed Colosseum began hosting combat sport. It wasn't for everyone in ancient Rome, to be sure. A stone's throw away, the popular Circus Maximus routinely hosted chariot racing for spectators numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The races were an event one could take their children or loved ones to, without the risk of shattering innocence by witnessing something impressionable minds could never unsee. And while the Circus Maximus also hosted bloody animal hunts, gruesome state-sponsored executions, and violent gladiator games, crowds were frequently much bigger for the comparatively enjoyable race events. In gladiator sport, classes and categories separated the combatants based on their individual styles, their skills with certain types of weapons, their age, and their experience. The most common type of gladiator used a sword and shield in combat, but there were others who displayed different styles and methods, like those who rode on horseback or in speeding chariots. The Samnite is widely regarded as history's earliest gladiator, and used oblong shields with common Roman weaponry of the era. The Murmillo carried bone-handle swords and large shields, with full-head helmets, arm and shin guards. The Threeks fought with short, curved swords called sicas, as well as protective belts and distinctive plumed helmets. The Dymacharis opted for no shields in favor of 2 swords, all but ensuring their contests ended in grievous bloodshed. Most rare and peculiar of all were the Retiarius, scantily clad warriors who carried tridents and fishing nets, with the aim of capturing, then spearing their opponents. The Retiarius were the least popular gladiator of their day, regarded by many as too effeminate for popular taste, and thus weaker than other warriors. With obvious overtones of homosexual bias, even opponents of the Retiarius expressed their embarrassment at having to compete against fighters seen as less than men. Another, stranger type of combatant was called adibate, who competed in helmets with no eye holes and preferred a loincloth to armor. The main purpose of the adibate was to get themselves wounded and ultimately killed in entertaining fashion. There was a reason for this. Andibate were convicted criminals with sentences of death that would be carried out to the maximum enjoyment of the masses. And the bestiarius utilized a variety of weapons while competing exclusively against wild animals. Indeed, humans weren't the only performers and victims to be found in Roman sporting arenas, which were grim destinations for wildlife of all kinds. To christen the start of the Roman Colosseum, a 3-month-long celebration was held, during which nearly 10,000 animals were brutally slaughtered to appease the crowd's questionable taste in entertainment. Predating the Barnum and Bailey circus by thousands of years, European gladiator shows also trained some animals, like elephants, to serve as amusement acts, performing practice tricks and stunts, although most of these poor beasts still met their fate at the end of some brute's sword whenever their perceived usefulness was outlived. In 83 AD, one of the most notorious spectacles of human versus beast combat was held under the Roman Emperor Domitian, who hosted a lavish event highlighting Roman might and superiority over mortal and animal kingdoms alike. In these games, an enslaved bestiarius, known as Carpophorus, thrilled the thousands who'd filled the arena to witness the spectacle when he faced 20 wild animals, one after the other. In the wake of this gorefest, Carpophorus became a revered symbol of strength and success in ancient Rome. Wild animals were also used in the arenas to maul convicted criminals to death, in particularly torturous punishments. But lawbreakers weren't the only ones to suffer gruesome deaths for show, as persecuted Christians were also literally fed to the lions. Indeed, as the popularity of the Colosseum exploded in Rome, and its exhibitions continued to evolve, Various breeds of animals were employed to take part in what would effectively be death matches. The specialized type of gladiators who competed in these contests were known as venators. One of the most popular beasts recruited for combat sport was none other than the king of the jungle himself, the lion. With a possible weight upwards of 500 pounds and the ability to run over 30 miles an hour, lions did more than provide a stark challenge to even the most savage combatant. They filled seats and provided crowds with surefire entertainment. The first lions that appeared in the gladiator arena were generally chained up to minimize their formidable abilities and balance the playing field a bit for their two-legged opponents. In time, however, they were turned loose to roam venues freely, keeping gladiators and spectators alike on their toes. So prolific was one lion's gladiator kill count that upon its death, the beast was honored with a headstone listing its grim accomplishments. Tigers were another choice high on the gladiator list. With their status as lone hunters in the wild, and the possibility of their reaching over 600 pounds, they were every bit as dangerous, if not more so, than lions in the combat arena. One surprising animal that was forced into the arenas was the giraffe. First brought to Rome by Julius Caesar, who possibly enjoyed the sheer spectacle of the towering creatures in combat, giraffes were an unlikely choice. Gentle animals who were not carnivores, giraffes provided rulers and audiences with a certain freak show factor that's proven popular in combat spectacles since the dawn of time. Due to its docile nature, the giraffe was often pitted against other wild animals, a practice which invariably resulted in the regal animal's death by slow mauling. After these unfortunate displays, an event generally carried on with more evenly matched contests. Regardless of the breeds used, the mere involvement of wild animals in gladiator sport remained a grim affair. Bears too found their way into the arena, after having been captured and transported from far away, then held in captivity and mistreated for extended periods of time, before being unleashed on an opponent in the arena, injured, angry, hungry, and bloodthirsty. Untold numbers of bewildered bears were killed in front of screaming crowds, as were a fair share of outmatched gladiators. The country of India proved fertile ground for even more exotic animals, as breeds like the crocodile and the rhino were imported to the booming Roman Empire for use in its increasingly outlandish and gruesome gladiator games. Rhinos in particular made life difficult for any human opponent, and not just because of the bulky beast's surprising agility. The rhino sports a thick hide that is also very hard to puncture, regardless of one's weapon of choice. And with fully grown rhinos tipping the scales at close to a possible 8,000 pounds, very few gladiators welcome the sight of them charging their way. At times, other less deadly animals appeared in the arena, with creatures such as hippos, horses, gazelles, goats, and even rabbits, all being herded into the dusty hellscape to put on some sort of show. However, one animal that appears to have never been recruited for combat sport was the wolf. As the ancient myth goes, Rome itself was founded by a pair of twin orphans named Romulus and Remus. After managing to escape with their lives after the king ordered them put to death, the siblings were aided in the wild by a benevolent she-wolf who suckled the babies in her cave, thus paving the way for the future city they would build. The age-old fable would prove pivotal in protecting the wolf from Rome's brutal gladiator games. Early observers of Christianity were particularly appalled by animal involvement in the gladiator games, with Cyprian notably writing, "Man is slaughtered that man may be gratified, and the skill that is best able to kill is an exercise and an art. Crime is not only committed, but it is taught." What can be said more inhuman? What more repulsive? Training is undergone to acquire the power to murder, and the achievement of murder is its glory. What state of things, I pray you, can that be? And what can it be like in which men, whom none have condemned, offer themselves to the wild beastmen of ripe age, of sufficiently beautiful person, clad in costly garments, living men, they are adorned for a voluntary death. Wretched men, they boast of their own miseries. They fight with beasts, not for their crime, but for their madness. It remains unknown when the very first female combatants entered the gladiator arena, but there is evidence that before too long, women were indeed waging war on the Colosseum floor. Stone art from the 2nd century reveals a fight between two women, listed as Amazonia and Aquileia, that apparently ended in a draw. Based on this detail, one can presume that even more females suited up for combat within imperious Italy, although any recorded history of their participation remains scarce and murky. One detail that highlights the patriarchy that permeated ancient times is the attire provided to female combatants. While their male counterparts could sport various styles of body armor, including helmets and other coverings, artwork from the era shows females competing in minimized gear, considerably stripped down and often bare-breasted, objectified and sexualized compared to the males. Even the swords used by the women differed from the longer, broader, more phallic versions used by the men. Piecing together the few snippets and asides from early writings that allude to the existence of female gladiators, it appears that the mere idea of female fighters drew a mixture of bemusement, ridicule, and scorn from Roman audiences, who regarded a woman's presence in the arena as evidence of the nation's moral decline. Somewhere around 200 AD, Emperor Septimius Severus officially prohibited women from competing in the gladiator games. Sadly, down through the centuries, this sort of chauvinistic mandate would become commonplace in organized sports. That is, until female athletes could no longer be denied, changing the minds of the powers that be, and thus changing the world. In another early mirror of our modern professional sports world, there were gladiators who took stock of their situations and saw the bigger picture. With rulers on raised thrones viewing their gory battles with barely more than a passing fancy, some fighters sought to organize, forming the early template of a workers' union. Often forgotten in unmarked graves after making the ultimate sacrifice for the state, the Gladiators' Union would see to it that felled fighters were honored with a funeral, an inscribed tombstone that detailed who they were, as well as what they accomplished during their lives and careers. Also acting as a sort of life insurance agent, the union saw to it that surviving families of a deceased gladiator would also receive money for their loss. Throughout much of Roman society, gladiators were seen as ideal examples of manhood, the bravest of the brave. Fans and followers acted as such, living vicariously through their favorite fighters for as long as they were around, as the Roman statesman and scholar Cicero wrote regarding the heart of the gladiator. Just look at the gladiators, either debased men or foreigners, and consider the blows they endure. Consider how they who have been well disciplined prefer to accept a blow than avoid it. How often it is made clear that they consider nothing other than the satisfaction of their master, or the people. Even when they are covered with wounds, they send a messenger to their master to inquire his will. If they have given satisfaction to their masters, they are pleased to fall. What even mediocre gladiator ever groans, ever alters the expression on his face? Which one of them acts shamefully, either standing or falling? And which of them, even when he does succumb, ever contracts his neck when ordered to receive the blow? As with many popular sports, those with no business being anywhere near the arena would sometimes throw their helmets into the ring, so to speak, and suit up to show off. Such was the case with famed leaders like Caligula, Titus, and Hadrian, all of whom stepped into their own arenas, albeit under staged circumstances, to let the people know they were man enough to compete on the ultimate judging ground. Perhaps the most shameful of these ruler-cum-warriors was the Emperor Commodus, who routinely attempted to impress audiences by spearing animals from the safe distance of his elevated throne all while clad in his famous lion skin. Commodus also went a step further, descending to the arena floor to face a rookie gladiator or an unprepared and sometimes physically disabled audience recruit. These poor fools were forced to compete with dulled or faulty weapons that ensured the emperor would win handily. And when he did, Commodus disgracefully awarded himself large sums of money from the state's coffers. How heroic. Additionally, Emperor Commodus's borderline obsession with the games may have had deeper roots than simple fandom. Throughout his reign, it was widely rumored that Commodus had been illegitimately fathered by a gladiator, as his mother, known as Faustina the Younger, was quite shameless about her wanton lust for a certain gladiator years prior. The narcissism that drove Commodus to such abuses of power would ultimately prove to be his undoing. On New Year's Eve, 192 AD, Commodus's lover poisoned his wine. When it didn't immediately kill him, his own trainer, fittingly named Narcissus, snuck into his room in the night and choked the emperor to death. Perhaps expectedly, the rise in popularity of gladiator sport went hand in hand with the cult of personality, and many gladiators would find themselves transformed into celebrities, and still others, sex symbols. With the common classes rabid for someone to look up to and something to believe in, a successful gladiator slaying all opponents who dared rise against him was ripe fodder for idolatry. Through the lens of thousands of years of hindsight, history has elevated only a handful of gladiators to pedestals that ensure their names and their reputations will endure forever. Marcus Attilius. A rarity in the sense that he willingly signed up to train and fight as a tiro, the term applied to a rookie gladiator. Attilius was thrown into the deep end in his very first match, where he squared off against the tough veteran Hilarus. After defeating Hilarus by submission, Attilius went on to squash another more accomplished opponent, winning the admiration of local graffiti artists, who swiftly began tagging Pompeii with pro-Attilius art. Art that would be preserved for all time after the eruption of Mount Vesuvius infamously buried the city and everything in it. Spiculus. Impressing his handlers in gladiator school to the point that they pitted him against Aptinatus, a rugged veteran with a daunting win streak. In his debut match, Spiculus rose to the challenge, killing his intimidating opponent and winning over Emperor Nero as a fan. The evolution of their unlikely friendship, wherein the emperor lavished the warrior with gifts, including his own palace, would nevertheless end in tragedy. Wrested from power by an uprising in the empire, Nero implored Spiculus to kill him before the angry mobs could. When the gladiator refused, Nero killed himself. But Spiculus would not get off so easy. Rampaging throughout the empire, the emancipated people tracked down the empire's favorite gladiator and beat him to death. Flamma. The veteran Syrian fighter was not only renowned for the length of his combat career, which spanned an unparalleled 34 fights, but also for winning his freedom several times, only to decline each and every offer. Despite all the good fortune that seemed to routinely come his way, Flamma died at age 30. Spartacus. Trafficked as a slave in his youth and forced into gladiator training, the famed Spartacus escaped and fled his captors, forming an army comprised of thousands of other disillusioned fighters. Returning to raise hell on the empire that wronged them, they drove the Romans back and beat them down. That is, until Rome regrouped and snuffed out the vengeful army, along with their leader. Despite the unique notoriety that could boost a winning gladiator's image, making a perilous existence at least a bit more tolerable, if not enjoyable at times, there were those who simply wanted nothing to do with the whole bloody mess, as evidenced by the legend of a German slave who'd found himself routed into a regrettable living as a gladiator. Excusing himself from his handlers on the day of an event, he stole away to relieve himself, instead ramming a toilet sponge down his throat and suffocating himself to death on the bathroom floor. It wasn't pretty, but it would have been even uglier in the combat arena. Indeed, when combatants wanted a way out, they'd find it, one way or another. In the 4th century, the Roman politician Symmachus chose 20 gladiators to compete in an upcoming event. However, those men weren't keen on being enlisted, and instead opted to foil the whole thing in grand fashion. On the day of the event, rather than perform, all 20 men killed themselves in the gladiators' holding area, stunning the gathered crowd and leaving their rulers perplexed indeed. In ancient Rome, it seemed that gladiator life was every bit as polarizing for the doers as it was for the viewers. In yet another reflection of today's sports world, a renowned gladiator could see his pictures or statues displayed in public, or find kids playing with primitive clay action figures crafted in his image. Early product endorsement also appeared during this time, with gatekeepers of the day keen to the fact that one's popularity could make another equally popular, merely by association. And, as is the wont with celebrity, more than a few successful gladiators made the leap to sex symbol for the masses, with some ancient Pompeii graffiti detailing the attractiveness of certain competitors. However, the situation was not all healthy admiration from afar, with some Roman women donning jewelry crafted with gladiators' blood. Some even went so far as using gladiator sweat, which was somewhat comically believed to be an aphrodisiac, in their cosmetics. It's not difficult to see why gladiators held such appeal to the opposite and same sex. Fit, rugged, and fearless, they effortlessly possessed the traits that half the population wished to be close to, and the other half wished to emulate. Almost no one of the day was unaware of, or held an indifferent opinion of, gladiator sport. Such a position naturally gave rise to some of the world's first groupies, a situation some gladiators took full advantage of in their private moments. After all, if a warrior couldn't be paid fairly for his services, he could at the very least prosper in other ways. Women from all walks of life would gather at places like Ludus Magnus, Rome's largest gladiator school and dormitory, to catch a glimpse of their favorite fighter, or for some, to catch more than a glimpse. Attendance in the gladiator arena quickly became something more than sport spectating, as interest from women of all walks grew stronger as events rolled on. The situation garnered enough notice that Emperor Augustus finally ordered women to be seated only in the upper tiers of the amphitheater, so as to keep them further away from those burgeoning objects of desire. Some elite women of higher Roman society even hired off-duty gladiators to serve as bodyguards for their evenings out, or evenings in, as was rumored. There were also instances of true romance blossoming between gladiators and common women, as evidenced by the famous love affair between Eppia and the gladiator Sergius. The ancient Roman poet Juvenal was critical of Eppia in his book Satires 6, wherein he questioned her motives and referred to her as a gladiatrix. A gladiatrix was the female version of the gladiator, a term given to both women who attempted to try their hand at combat and women known to be romantically involved with said combatants. A gladiatrix generally existed under the radar of the day. Female fighters were rare, and those involved in the sport for romantic reasons almost always operated in the shadows, on the fringes of a successful gladiator's formidable notoriety. Juvenal also derisively wrote of the gladiatrix, musing whether the women involved in any capacity of gladiator sport weren't simply current or aspiring prostitutes plying their trade. So, was Eppia a glorified prostitute, or was she a woman in love? Both conditions seem to greatly threaten many men of ancient Rome. The answer to the question lies perhaps in the outcome of the affair between Eppia and Sergius. Successfully retired from gladiator life, the aging Sergius vacated Rome for a life in Egypt, and he took his Eppia with him. Although it's not known for certain, it's very possible they lived out the rest of their lives together. Furthermore, any gladiator who survived arena life with the opportunity for a post-games existence was known as a ruderius. He would be gifted a special wooden sword called a rudis, which was a lasting reminder of his accomplished past and hard-won freedom. There were gladiators who, despite having the ability to walk away and leave the games behind, opted to stay and referee, or train up-and-coming fighters in the various schools of Rome. These men often had no families or loved ones to speak of, and combat sport was all they knew. Still others looking to lay down their swords would be approached by the sports organizers with monetary offers to continue, usually due to their impressive skills, bankable names, or popular standings with the public. While it's true that gladiator life was difficult, dangerous, and usually abbreviated, it had still more perks, like the taverns and brothels that were conveniently located near the gladiators' barracks. For those who regularly risked everything to entertain, and rarely walked away unscathed, a cold pint and a warm body was the very least their society could provide. The Roman Empire also made the best medical and healthcare available to those chosen few who made their living inside the arenas. The most heralded doctor of his time, Aelius Galenus, often known simply as Galen, was employed to treat gladiators at Ephesus, years after the ancient Greek city fell under Roman control. Galen's views and methodology were revolutionary, and his work influenced Western medicine for over 1,000 years afterward. Indeed, without the foundations laid by Galen, humanity would have been undoubtedly slower to many of its medical understandings and advancements. When Galen reached Rome in 162 AD, his methods immediately clashed with the accepted mystic-based practices of the era. Equal parts physician and philosopher, Galen had no time for legends, deities, or superstitions, preferring instead to use his findings from dissection and vivisection as guides. He urged his students to do the same, instructing all who were interested to examine the fresh corpses of dead gladiators for anatomical enlightenment. When Rome's existing medical practitioners vehemently rejected the firebrand Galen as a member of their close-knit fraternity, he astutely began to fear assassination and left Rome to practice elsewhere. He would later be called back to aid in combating a lethal plague that decimated fully half of the empire, treating and repairing countless gladiators along the way. Galen also had influence over the gladiator diet. Subsisting on standard meals of beans and barley, fighters badly needed to boost their calcium intakes. They accomplished this by way of a primitive form of protein powder, wood and bone ash, mixed in vinegar. Galen also wrote of the gladiator physique not as toned and muscular, but flabby. This was by design. Before a contest, gladiators were overfed with copious amounts of oily foods as a way of providing extra protection for their internal organs. After all, nothing ruins a perfectly good spleen like a gleaming sword blade. And for those men who envied the hypnotic effect many gladiators held over women, there was hope. It was widely believed that the blood of a gladiator was a natural aphrodisiac, and that imbibing a dose would boost sexual performance. This naturally led to a black market on so-called gladiators' blood, the origins of which were dubious and untraceable. One must wonder how many sheep and lambs secretly met their ends to satisfy the booming demand for warriors' blood performance enhancers. Still more peculiar medical beliefs revolved around the blood of the era's gladiators. Some physicians of ancient Rome believed that drinking a gladiator's blood from a fresh wound would in effect cure epilepsy. As a result, there were instances when desperate people following medical advice dashed onto the arena floor to drink blood from a downed gladiator's wounds. And a dead gladiator's internal organs weren't safe either. Also pitched as a cure for seizures was the plan of swallowing 9 helpings of a gladiator's liver to cure the affliction. Why the number 9 remains unclear, as historical records shed no light on this detail. Passionate ways. Over a span of many years, several rulers attempted to end gladiator sport, but the orders never seemed to stick, until they did. As strong as it was, religious opposition alone is not what ended the games. The crisis of the 3rd century, as it's known, blitzed Rome with strife from all sides. Plague, war, invasion, and state depression all played large roles in chipping away at the relative frivolity of watching men and beasts maim and slaughter each other in packed arenas. In keeping with, or perhaps introducing, deceptive political sleight of hand that permeated nations down through the centuries, Rome's rulers attempted to keep the gladiator games going as a way of distracting the public from the empire's mounting problems. The Roman philosopher Seneca, himself an avid attendee of the gladiator games, eventually experienced a change of heart, writing, "All the previous fighting has been merciful by comparison. Now finesse is set aside, and we have pure, unadulterated murder. The combatants have no protective covering. Their entire bodies are exposed to the blows. Like so many of the combatants who competed in it, went out on its sword in 404 AD. The last known historical record of a gladiator contest was on January 1st of that year, and although none who flooded into the amphitheater that day could know it, an event would occur on the arena floor that so shocked the populace, it would change public sentiment on gladiator sport forevermore. The event was initiated by a lone monk in attendance. His name was Telemachus, and he would soon unwittingly become history's blood sport martyr. Visiting Rome to attend church over the Christmas holiday, Telemachus found himself moved by the droves of people who flooded the Colosseum to see the gladiator games. Joining the masses, he entered the arena and watched stoically as the first two combatants took center stage. At that point, it was as if time stood still. What the solitary monk bore witness to left him aghast. The combatants' merciless onslaughts, the crowd's crazed bloodlust, their rulers' bemused indifference. Telemachus stood watching, his gentle spirit steadily overcome by deep sorrow and dread. One can imagine him wincing and rubbing his eyes against the dust that hung in the air. To one side lay regal wild animals, butchered, dead or dying. To the other side, strong gladiators in the same shape, all gasping their last breaths, or already collecting flies. This was what people did to amuse themselves? This was what life was like in majestic Rome? The monk had a difficult time wrapping his head around it. As another pair of warriors were introduced and began battle, Telemachus made his way down from the stands all the way onto the arena floor. One can imagine the crowd pointing, staring, buzzing amongst themselves. Such behavior was not a common occurrence, to be sure, but the lone monk was not done. Eyeing the thousands of curious, confused, angry faces surrounding him, he shouted a call to arms. "In the great name of him who died for men, Christ Jesus." It didn't go over well. According to legend, one of two things happened next. The affronted crowd became enraged and stoned the monk to death on the spot, or the gladiators attacked and hacked him to pieces. Whichever version is true, one thing remains certain. The public murder of Telemachus in the Colosseum that day turned the hearts and minds of most people against gladiator sport, once and for all. Emperor Honorius, who moments earlier had presided over the savage spectacle, condemned the games, stating that Rome no more should wallow in this old lust of paganism and make her festal hour dark with the blood of man who murdered man. After all the bloodshed, beauty destroyed, and lives lost, the brutal murder of one peaceful outsider was all it took. Almost instantly, the people seemed to lose their interest, and indeed the stomach, for gladiator sport. It was as if a spell had been broken. Just like that, a spectacle that had been a part of daily life for generations was over. Fast forward now to the 20th century, as President Ronald Reagan took the podium at Washington, D.C.'s annual prayer breakfast, looking out over the assembled crowd, much as St. Telemachus did so many ages before. He paused, cleared his throat, and began a story.
And he followed a crowd into the Colosseum. And then there in the midst of this great crowd, he saw the gladiators come forth, stand before the emperor and say, "We who are about to die salute you." And he realized they were going to fight to the death for the entertainment of the crowd. And he cried out, "In the name of Christ, stop." And his voice was lost in the tumult there in the great Colosseum. And as the games began, he made his way down through the crowd and climbed over the wall and dropped to the floor of the arena. Suddenly the crowd saw this scrawny little figure making his way out to the gladiators and saying over and over again, in the name of Christ, stop. And they thought it was part of the entertainment, and at first they were amused. But then when they realized it wasn't, they grew belligerent and angry. And as he was pleading with the gladiators, in the name of Christ, stop, one of them plunged his sword into his body. And as he fell to the sand of the arena in death, his last words were, in the name of Christ, stop. And suddenly a strange thing happened. The gladiators stood looking at this tiny form lying in the sand. A silence fell over the Colosseum. And then someplace up in the upper tiers, an individual made his way to an exit and left, and others began to follow. And in the dead silence, everyone left the Colosseum. That was the last battle to the death between gladiators in the Roman Colosseum. Never again did anyone kill, or did men kill each other for the entertainment of the crowd. One tiny voice that could hardly be heard above the tumult. In the name of Christ, stop. It is something we could be saying to each other throughout the world today.
Indeed, the world's gladiators rose with great might, fearsome skill, and never-before-seen showmanship. And in their day, they ruled with clenched fists, steely eyes, and blood-soaked swords. As history has shown, nothing lasts forever. And so, eventually, went those gladiators into their good night. Those warriors of an untamed era, fading, 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 with the roars of their loyal crowds, until nothing remained but echoes. The echoes of steel on flesh, of victorious war cries, of screams for mercy, of bellows to the heavens. Gone like a great storm that raged, then passed from view, leaving glorious wreckage in its wake. The gladiators faded from our view in a plume of dust, from the most heralded stone arena our planet will ever know, an arena that crumbles year by year, brick by brick, but never fades from our memory. Indeed, like any movement that captures the hearts and minds of the people, if only for a while, those gladiator days live on, in the stone slabs that hold their likenesses and legends, in the minds of scholars and historians around the world, in the comparatively homogenized modern sports world, in our history books, our movies and television shows, and our pop culture conventions. For us, the gladiator games are a fascinating footnote in the world's rich and sometimes sordid history. But for those warriors who shed their blood and the blood of others, and those who laid down their lives and took the lives of others, the gladiator games were much more than mere sport and spectacle. The gladiator games were life. Long live the gladiator games!